I'll pass over to Scott Hogan-Smith, who will start our dialogue this evening.
Thanks very much, Heath. And I guess for this evening's chat, we'll just go through what the basics of the JobSaver scheme are, and from there, some specific details about how you go about applying and what they are looking for. So the JobSaver scheme, so we've had the first lot is the COVID business grant from the New South Wales Government. That's intended to cover weeks 1 through to 3 of the lockdown. And JobSaver kicks in effective from the 4th week of the lockdown, so basically from the 18th of July. JobSaver is a scheme which is based on wages and headcount. So if you're an employer, so there's a scheme for employers and a scheme for entities that do not employ. For the employers one, it's equivalent to 40% of the weekly payroll for work performed in New South Wales. So what that means is that if you are an Australia-wide employer, if you are an employer with employees in more than one state, New South Wales is only interested in your New South Wales employees and your New South Wales-based wages. So that's what this is about. And when you go through the application process, you'll need to isolate out your New South Wales wages from the other wages. And we'll come to that a little bit later on. Now, it's a weekly scheme and it's based on weekly wages. The minimum payment is $1,500 per week, and the maximum payment, which the government amended this today during the 11 a.m. press conference, is not $10,000 anymore, it's $100,000. So what the government announced today were 2 key changes, which you may have seen in our newsflash. The first one is that maximum payment is no longer $10,000, it's $100,000. The $50 million maximum threshold for turnover, aggregated turnover, is now $250 million. And that's as a response probably to the building and construction people, because a lot of them and a lot of the larger contractors weren't covered by this scheme. They now are. So this moves it back to very much a cash flow boost kind of scheme, as opposed to a more limited one just for small and medium businesses. The weekly payroll is based on a business activity statement number. The business activity statement number is the one from the BAS that you lodged prior to the 26th of June. So for most people, this is going to be their March quarter BAS. If you're a monthly BAS lodger and not a monthly IAS lodger, but a monthly BAS lodger, and you've got a BAS, probably your May business activity statement, which you would have lodged before the 26th of June, then you can use that to submit to Service New South Wales. But they're after a BAS, and the checklists inside Service New South Wales are for BASs, they're not for IASs. So for the vast majority of people, we're going to be talking about your March quarter BAS and submitting that to Service New South Wales. If you're a non-employing business, then there's a scheme which gives you $1,000 per week. So if you're a sole trader, if you're someone who is a director of an entity that you might run a business, but there's no employee in the business, then the $1,000 per week arrangement could apply to you as long as you meet the reduction in turnover figure. And obviously $1,000 a week is better than the current disaster relief payment that the Commonwealth is offering, which is basically equivalent to the job seeker scheme under the previous arrangements from the federal government. So you're probably better off with the $1,000 a week scheme, but you can't claim both. So
well, just one of the questions that's come through here from Anna is, do I have to split out my New South Wales and my interstate wages when I'm doing my reporting for Services New South Wales on the application?
The answer to that is yes. As I said, the Service New South Wales is only interested in New South Wales-based employees, and they're only interested in New South Wales-based wages. So if you have Australia-wide wages, if you have wages that you're reporting on your BAS, which would be a consolidated number, then you need to split out your New South Wales wages from your other Australian wages. Going back to the BAS as well, if you are a monthly lodger of your BAS and you haven't lodged your BAS before the 26th of June, then the OSR, your Service New South Wales, is after the BAS, the most recent BAS lodged before the 26th of June. So if you haven't lodged your monthly BAS for May, then you'll look at your monthly BAS for April. And the reason we say that is because, as Dominic Perrottet said today, a whole lot of resources have been pulled in from across government to process these applications in Service New South Wales. So there's a whole lot of people who've never dealt with this before. They don't know what a BAS is. They don't know what a tax return is, but they've got a checklist in front of them. And they're checking everything off against the checklist. So we're advising everyone to give Service New South Wales exactly what they want, and not really to deviate from that unless there's a really good reason and explanation for it. Now, so that's the basic scheme. You've got to have a decline of 30% or more. And unlike Cash Flow Boost and unlike JobSeeker, which were specific for, Cash Flow Boost was a sort of general credit, which you could use for anything. JobKeeper was about keeping people employed. You've still got to keep people employed. Your headcount cannot go down under this scheme. But funding for this scheme can only be used to pay business expenses. So you can't really save the money that you're going to get under this scheme. It has to be used for paying business expenses such as salaries and wages, utilities, perishable goods, marketing, financial and legal advice, your accountants, for example, and other business-related expenses. It can't be used, for example, to continue to pay down a business loan or some sort of capital expense. It needs to be an ordinary business expense. Now, Service New South Wales haven't published a comprehensive list of what they consider to be a business expense, but anything that you're doing day to day to pay for business and to pay for your business to continue to operate, that's what we anticipate that they're going to say is an eligible expense.
And Scott, probably worth adding to that point, the Services New South Wales program does have an auditing requirement and a documentation requirement for evidence of your use of funds towards business expenses. The review period and the record keeping requirement is up to 5 years to be able to demonstrate that you've used the funding, particularly in the case of JobSaver, used the funding towards those eligible expense categories. So just do note that where you have got record of something that you spent the money on, do keep that record, because subject to post-review of these programs coming to a conclusion, there may be a review or an audit process that they undertake on businesses that may not have been eligible, and they will ask you for that information to evidence it.
Jakin, a couple of questions coming through here as well. As a contractor, not a sole trader, so I'll take that as a contractor. So that's either invoicing under an ABN or a company ABN, where I charge customers on a job-by-job basis. Can I still claim the $1,000 per week state government JobSaver?
To the extent that you're not employing anybody, then you meet the non-employer categorisation or definition, and therefore you would meet the $1,000 a week claim for JobSaver because you don't have any payroll cost.
One other distinction to note on the employee. So if you're if you have a book of employees and you stood them down, or maybe they're on reduced hours and they're claiming the disaster relief payment, then you are still able to claim JobSaver for them. So if you have employees that you've stood down, you can claim JobSaver for them. If you are a non-employing entity, or you're in like a partnership or something like that, and a director claims the disaster relief payment, you cannot then claim the JobSaver payment. So there's an important distinction between the non-employing and the employees, and between business owners and employees. So employees, if your employees have gone to claim the Commonwealth Disaster Relief Payment, then you are still eligible to claim JobSaver for those employees. They're not knocked out. But as I said, if you're the business owner, you're a director, something like that, and you are claiming the Commonwealth Disaster Relief Payment, then you can't claim the JobSaver payment. And the Prime Minister announced today that the disaster relief payment was being increased to $750. Obviously, JobSaver is $1,000. So if you're eligible for JobSaver, you're probably better off claiming that rather than the disaster relief payment.
Scott, there's another question here. This has come through from Dr. Elliott, and this is a question that would apply in relation to anyone who would be a healthcare professional that is operating private practice, whereby I have employees likely running through a service entity. So this is a probably more specific question in relation to healthcare. So, and the question that Dr. Elliott asks is, if I'm paying wages through a second party as a service payment, does that count? And I think that's about, would that count as wage payments from Dr. Elliott if they're via a service entity? But Scott, I think that it's actually the service entity that would be eligible, not the person paying the service fee.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Because you've got to be able to show it's the entity that has the head count that is the one that is eligible to claim. So if you had the service trust, then it's the service trust that would be eligible to claim the JobSaver payment.
Yep. Okay. Now, there's several questions coming through here as well, Jakin and Scott, that are relating to the test period. So, of course, this being the gazetted 26th of June of this year through to the 17th of July. And a lot of people are asking, well, hang on, I was in holidays in July 2019, or the business only started up partway through. What guidance are we getting from Service New South Wales with respect to their receptiveness to alternate testing and the methodology?
They're giving guidance on using alternative dates to compare against, as opposed to the 2019 period. But the language and the guidelines that are issued as far as the measurement for the current year revenue period is quite specific, and the language quite purposely noted from the 26th of June for JobSaver purposes, from the 26th of June until, at the moment as it stands, the end of this month of July. And it's a consecutive fortnight period at a minimum. You can make it a longer period, but at least a minimum consecutive fortnight period in that period of time. For the purposes of them benchmarking that revenue compared to a 2019 comparative period, if you don't have one that's comparative, then it's basically any period that you can draw a reference to before the 26th of June, pre-lockdown. So for businesses that were new starting, businesses that changed their structure, businesses that had a sale event or the like, you can draw upon comparative reasons, comparative periods, so long as you can explain your reasoning and rationale to Services New South Wales of why that's a relevant benchmark period.
Yep. And I think just following on from that, Jakin, I suspect that this will be a more difficult barrow to push if you are not in a highly impacted industry code. So to the extent you're trying to go an alternate period or an alternate test or date range, if you have a sufficient logic, argument and backup data to provide to Services New South Wales, and you happen to be in one of those highly impacted industry codes, Jakin, I suspect that would go better for the application.
Correct. I think the advice that we'd be giving people at the moment is submit as much information as you can as well as part of your application. Whilst it may not be necessarily the specific information that they ask for on the checklist of your online application form, the more information you can give Services New South Wales to explain your position and justify your circumstances, the better, rather than them come back and ask for questions, which again would only really just delay payment to the extent you're then eligible.
Yeah. There's another question here through from John, and that question is the $100,000 threshold now. So we've had a great increase in the amount of payments that are going to come out of the state government. And John's asked the question, is that as an aggregate? So if I've got 4 separate companies that each happen to employ, $100,000 worth of wages a week, can I claim it 4 times, or is it looked at on a group basis?
It's per ABN. So per ABN that is an employer, each ABN is entitled to the grant value as it stands at the maximum at the moment of $100,000 a week.
Yeah.
Provided that each ABN can demonstrate the reduction in turnover required and maintain the employee headcount and the like, then each ABN holder should be able to apply for the JobSaver grant.
Yeah. So on that basis, then, it is likely, if that was reviewed, for example, though, that Services New South Wales would likely review the group turnover, then the individual ABN turnovers, then look at them all next to each other. So that they probably cut that a few ways, I think, before they actually made the payment. Jakin, your thoughts?
Well, I think it's important to note that one of the eligibility requirements is the measurement of aggregated turnover. So where you do have group businesses under separate ABNs, you would need to consider that aggregation from the turnover measurement in the first place to make sure you fall within that 75,000 and up to $250 million group turnover basis to be eligible. And then on a per ABN basis, you would measure your individual respective drop in turnover. Yep,
okay. There are also a couple of questions. There seems to be a lot of questions coming through about the dates of 26th through to the 17th in terms of that, about how I claim and what dates I'm using for the drop. Now, how do I apply this 2-week period within the 26th through to the 17th?
Scott, I'll take that.
So
probably important to note, the measurement dates are common to the standalone New South Wales business support grant that's been open since last week. And as Scott mentioned, the design intent of these grants are to technically fund different periods of time. So the standalone support grant, which was the up to 70% drop to $15,000 grant payment, essentially is funding the lockdown period from the 26th of June to the 17th of July. The purposes of the introduction for JobSaver and its application as of this week is designed to be effective from funding businesses from the 18th of July onwards. So for purposes of measuring your turnover drops, obviously there are similarities in the turnover dates that are relevant. The likelihood, if you qualify for the first business support grant, then there would most likely be continued eligibility for JobSaver. But having said that too, acknowledging that the construction industry in particular is affected as of only really a week ago with regards to the further lockdown and constraints on construction, they may not have been eligible for the one-off grant earlier, but they will definitely or should definitely fall into eligibility for JobSaver. So the design is to really separate those two distinct periods as a result of increasing restrictions applied to the community.
Yeah. And can I just also add to that the JobSaver scheme is not a specific wage subsidy, so you don't have to pay, notionally pay the JobSaver scheme to employees. It's there to it's designed to help you keep employees on your books and to fund business expenses. It's not a specific thing that you need to give to an employee, unlike what JobKeeper was.
There seem to be some other questions coming through too, which is about demonstrating the revenue drop with invoices issued over the period. This is, I think, a cash versus accruals question, Scott.
Yeah, so you would use the same methodology that you use on your BAS to report what your revenue drop is to the OSR and to Services New South Wales. The reason we do that is because you are submitting the BAS to them. Again, this is people with checklists, going through checklists, ticking boxes to make sure that you are qualified for this funding. And so you want to present everything to them in the same manner that you present your BAS in. So if your BAS is accruals, then you're going to report your revenue drop on an accrual basis. If your BAS is on a cash basis, then you're going to present your revenue drop on a cash basis.
Yeah, and I think one of the other interesting observations has been that pretty well, if you're eligible for the state government grant last year, they're pretty well just coming out by default this year as well, aren't they? So it's if you're eligible last year, they're basically deeming you automatically eligible for this year.
Yes.
And it's probably also another question, Scott. There seems to be a lot of people trying very hard to cut dates across different periods, across different things in different ways. My experience has been a lot of those businesses aren't actually eligible. They're trying to sort of squeeze it to make it. And I suspect, Scott, I suspect those businesses are going to come under a fair bit of review from the state government.
Yes. The state government is only just started now to do reviews of the previous funding from COVID last year. And we would expect a high level of compliance activity from the OSR. The OSR is never going to have this much information on businesses available to them. So they'll have your tax return, they'll have your BAS, they'll have payroll information, they'll be able to cross-reference all of that and basically build a sort of database on New South Wales businesses. So when they come to auditing this data, they will be fairly active in the compliance space. Now, having said that, with the extension to the lockdown announced today, you would expect a little bit more flexibility on dates and qualifications, but not that much.
Yep. Now, there's also another couple of questions in there as well. And this is about, so of course, there's 3 payments that we're considering at the moment, which is effectively the state government JobSaver, which happens after the issuance of the state government COVID grant. There is also the federal government COVID disaster payment under Services Australia. If I'm a director of a company, Scott, that company remunerates me typically in some fashion. The company is eligible for the JobSaver. The company is also eligible for the state government grant. Can I, as a director of that company, separately claim the federal government disaster payment, or does that create problems?
I think it creates problems because you're effectively having a double dip of the system. So if you're primarily, so you've basically got to decide as an employee. So if you're an employee and you're the business owner, you've basically got to decide which way you're going to be funded, because the disaster relief payment is there for people who have had their working hours effectively reduced. If you're a director of the company, so you're eligible for JobSaver, you can manipulate your own remuneration. I would be claiming the JobSaver rather than the disaster relief payment.
And Jakin, I think, am I correct in the question that if you are a director of a company and you've claimed the grant, the state government grant in your company, and then you go and claim the federal government disaster payment, you're obliged to repay the state government grant?
Well, you're effectively then making a false declaration to both parties in terms of both of the eligibility requirements at the federal level and the state level require you to make a declaration that you're not in receipt of either sources of funding in conjunction with that department. So there is the issue that you are making a false statement to either the federal government or the state government, which, as far as the state government is concerned, that carries a criminal penalty application. So be very, very cautious about doing so.
Yep. I'm just having a review of some of another question. Will they be extending JobSaver past the 30th of July? Well, lockdown's extended, and I think that's a given. That's happening already.
Yes. So I believe that this is going to be, basically it'll be on a week-to-week basis. So for as many weeks as the lockdown is extended, you'll be eligible for JobSaver.
Yep.
And insofar as we know, it's once an application is made, it'll continue to remain valid until the end of that lockdown period, or until the lockdown comes to a conclusion.
Correct.
One of the I think important things to note as well is that JobKeeper last year was administered by the tax office, and the tax office has vast amounts of information about your business that the state government does not. So what the tax office federally did a really, really good job on was making sure people who weren't eligible for cash flow boost or JobKeeper didn't get it. Right, so the tax office were really sophisticated in this. The state government are not going to be as sophisticated in this. It's a given. Service New South Wales crashes 2 or 3 times a day. If you ring them up, you'll be on the phone for 2 or 3 hours. The state government have pulled out people who are normally administering receipts for your boat registration now to help deal with this sort of stuff like that. What do you think the likely fallout's going to be, Scott, Jakin, in terms of this when reviews happen?
Well, there'll be definitely some issues of overclaim or an administration around how they've handled assessing people and the like. But again, based off the reliance on information that they don't normally have access to in order to make these assessments, there's going to be undoubtedly errors and issues arising. But I imagine they're going to be doing everything they can to support the business community. So it won't necessarily be a big stick that would follow unless it's really intended mischief.
Yeah, and I think this is exactly the same way as cash flow boost and JobKeeper was last year. The New South Wales government just wants to hit the economy with as much cash as possible, as quickly as they can.
Yep.
Just to answer the question that came in, is an ACN still eligible for JobSaver? No.
Yeah. Two more questions. First is a good one. Do I pay tax on JobSaver?
I don't think the ATO has announced a position yet, but I would assume that you would, because it's a reimbursement of business costs, basically.
Yeah. And what about the actual upfront grant, Scott? Is that going to be accessible as well?
The upfront grant, I'm pretty sure, has been made tax-free.
Yeah.
Whether JobSaver falls under the same definition of the New South Wales grants that they've given the tax exemption to, we still yet to wait for any confirmation or clarification otherwise.
Yep. The key to note for that is that the ATO would have seen all the guidelines in detail at the same time that we all did on Monday morning when we got up. So we don't have a decision yet. But as Jakin said, the first grant, the tiered 7.5, 10.5, 15, that's tax-free.
Probably an important point to also make, the federal COVID disaster payment, that is taxable, as similar to any other sort of government, federal government income support. So just to note too that there is a distinction there as well, particularly for those that may have considered claiming that over and above the New South Wales state government support grant.
We've got another question there in relation to what we feel the timing is likely to be on the state government COVID grant and how quickly we might get that paid.
Dominic Perrottet said today 3 to 5 days after approval of application, and then it'll be a payment each week. So we would probably say that on the anniversary of your payment each week, so your claim being approved each week, you'll get a payment. That's the best information we have at the moment for it. That's likely to change. It's likely to be sped up, given the New South Wales government doesn't want to do any more damage to the economy under this scheme.
Yeah, I think one comment I might make on that one as well is that I know from talking to our clients that if they received the COVID grant last year, they pretty well put their application in and got their COVID grant paid this year within about 24 hours, right? Because you're deemed automatically in. For example, if you run a restaurant or a bar or something like that, you're automatically in. But if you've got one of these curly circumstances that needs a human being to look at it because you don't fit into the standard, then I think it's likely that it's not going to be a 24-hour process. It's going to take quite a deal longer.
Correct. And as we said, the Services New South Wales has a whole lot of people in place now that don't normally deal with anything like this, following checklists. So that it's not a particularly sophisticated operation. This is not the ATO we're talking about. So a lot of this is going to be done on a bit of faith and trust, as opposed to scientific data analysis. I said there was a question on headcount and maintenance of headcount. That's an interesting one because basically it's going to be a declaration that you're going to maintain your headcount, and once you're eligible, you're in and you're in. So that will more than likely be the place that is focused on when they come around to audit, as opposed to needing to change something when it's in.
On that point too, Scott, because I think it was noted in the initial government grant that if staff resigned through the period of the lockdowns, that wouldn't count against an employer for any drop in headcount that was of their own decision making. So it wouldn't count against an employer for therefore becoming eligible for the grants. Correct.
So there is a requirement to notify Services New South Wales if your employee headcount does drop. But at the moment, we don't exactly know how that's going to work. I would say Services New South Wales is going to be busy over the next couple of weeks just getting applications through. So if there is a reduction in headcount, then there is a requirement to tell Services New South Wales. That's probably a phone call, but we don't have a exact method yet for, hey, we've had a reduction in headcount, we need you to reduce your JobSaver payment to us.
Yeah. There's another question in relation to timing of payments and test periods and things like that from Ebony. And in terms of that, I guess my comments, Ebony, if you're in a highly impacted list in terms of what it is that you do, then you are very likely to get the grant, right? But in terms of if you are going to have to put some documentation around about why you're eligible, because on the basis of it, you are not eligible, then you just need to have good information put together in relation to that. And it all needs to be submitted together in a format that will make sense to someone who's reviewing it, who is not financially sophisticated. And again, Ebony, I just recommend contacting your partner or contact here in Ecovas who can help you do that.
And one of the things we've talked about as well is that obviously this is a 2-week comparative period. So if you have an invoice which is only paid once a month, but you will be making sales throughout that month, the OSR, Service New South Wales, I keep saying OSR, Service New South Wales is interested in a 2-week period. So you would almost need to dive into the detail of your sales per week to get the 2-week period out, as opposed to the invoice once a month that's actually being paid.
Indeed.
But yeah, as Heath said, it's something to discuss with your Ecovas partner and manager to get an application in, because if you're on the highly impacted list, you would absolutely be eligible for these payments and should get these payments.
There's an interesting one there from Rami in relation to disaster payments, Scott. Can you see that one?
Yes. So effectively, yes. So I assume. So if you're, let's clarify. So if you're an employee and you're getting disaster payments, then you're fine to keep getting the disaster payments. If you're an employer and your employee is getting disaster payments, you can still claim the JobSaver payment, even though they're getting the disaster payments. So there's an important distinction there between those two things. If you're a non-employing entity, you're the director of a non-employing entity, or you're the only employee of a non-employing entity, because you're the director or MD or something like that, and you're claiming the disaster relief payment, you can't get JobSaver. So you need to make a choice about which one that you get. So it depends on the circumstances, but in general, if you're a business owner and you're getting disaster relief payment, you're not eligible for JobSaver.
Also, I think on those disaster payments, the first 3 weeks of the federal payments were continued to be applied for, whereas from week 4 onwards, they became automatic. So needed you to opt in on the automation of those payments from week 4 onwards. If you wanted to look at claiming the state grants, then we'd advise you not to opt in.
Yep. In terms of that, are there any other key items that it's worthwhile raising here, Jakin, Scott? I think that's sort of really the guts of it at the moment, isn't it?
Look, it is. And just to answer another question on this, as the sole director of a non-employing entity, will payments to me be deemed business expenses with regards to JobSaver? Now, non-employing entities, so when you go to apply for JobSaver, what you're saying to Services New South Wales is that this entity, this business, the same as a sole trader business, this business is responsible for giving me my income. So I'm the person that takes the income out of this business and I use that to live on it. So on that basis, you would be eligible for the $1,000 a week payment.
Yep.
There was another question there from Yvonne. If your payroll is 40% is below $1,500 a week, do you still get the $1,500? Yes, Yvonne. For an employer, $1,500 is the minimum payment that they're going to provide.
And that sort of goes back to the point about this being a grant to pay business expenses as opposed to a grant specifically to pay and subsidise your employees. So part of it is headcount and maintaining your headcount to be eligible and to maintain eligibility. But how you spend that money, you don't need to spend that money specifically on subsidising employees. You can spend it on, as I said, as we've said before, and we've covered earlier, on business expenses.
Yep. Scott, we've got another question there, just wanting you to reconfirm in relation to the period of which JobSaver will be assessed in terms of our downturn.
So I think Jakin, you covered that off before.
Yeah, so the turnover test periods essentially is from, as it stands at the moment, any minimum fortnight period starting from the 26th of June to the 30th of July, as it stands at the moment.
Yeah, so you pick your test period, and you pick your test period obviously to make sure that you fall in within the eligibility.
Yep. Now another question around how this works if I'm actually earning our income or our business trades through a family discretionary trust. In terms of that, and income is split, do you both qualify if the income is split 50-50 between husband and wife?
Jakin, have you got that, or do you want me to answer?
I'll let you go, Scott.
So the short answer, so if the business is a family trust, assume the family trust has got an ABN, GST registered, all those sorts of things. One is, so you still qualify. One of you will qualify for the non-employing entity payment.
Yeah, but it's not going to be both. And then what happens if the individual beneficiaries then go and apply for the disaster payment? I think it knocks out the state government grant for the trust, doesn't it?
Correct.
Yep. Yeah.
It's similar to a self-employed director employing themselves to the company.
Yeah, the standard non-employing rules apply.
Yep, I'm just reviewing the questions now. John, I think we'd answered your questions, or at least I'd answered them in the Q&A section on some of your more larger group employer questions. John, just drop me a note if there's anything we've missed in terms of a response through to you. We've got another question in relation to test periods, Jakin and Scott.
2 weeks.
2 weeks
again,
at a minimum.
And again, remembering that these are people that aren't used to dealing with this in Services New South Wales with a checklist ticking boxes. So you just want to make sure that you're giving them exactly what's on the eligibility criteria.
Yeah. Then we've got a question from Megan in relation to the eligibility, in relation to, and also the requirement to show that you have business expenses of which to use the state government grant to pay or reimburse. What happens if I'm a sole trader and I don't have many of these expenses? Should I claim the disaster payment or claim the JobSaver?
Megan, it would come down to, you may not necessarily have employees, but you would have other business costs still connected and associated to your business. So these could be motor vehicle, insurances, memberships, registrations, and the like. They would still form part of the eligible business expenditure list that would be able to be funded from what JobSaver is going to provide.
We've got another question on payroll from Serena Ma. How do they calculate the payroll? Is it an average or a fortnightly payroll?
So what they're doing is they're taking the number on your BAS. So they're taking W1 on your BAS and they're dividing it by the BAS period. So it's really as simple as that. They're not looking at individual week-to-week fortnightly pay periods. They're endeavouring to match it back to the BAS at W1. And again, that goes back to the people who are doing this inside Services New South Wales and assessing your application have a checklist. And so that what they'll be doing is, the BAS for March, the March quarter had this many weeks in it or this many days in it. We're going to divide W1 by those number of days. And then to work out your weekly payroll, we'll times that by 7. That's the formula that's been articulated that they're going to use. Very, very simple formula, not going to work for quite a few businesses that we've experienced so far because of variations in payroll, expanding payrolls, new employees, etc. But that's all part of making the case to OSR when you do the application. But at the moment, it's a very, very simple formula. As I said, W1 divided by the number of days in the March quarter times by 7, that's your weekly wages.
Brilliant. Look, everyone, I think we're getting close to sort of wrapping up. Thank you, everyone, for all of your questions thus far this evening. Does anyone have any other questions that haven't been asked or answered fully? because you do have us for a little bit longer. So if there are any other questions, please ask them now. Or again, if we're at the level of questions whereby we would have to start sharing confidential or private information, then of course, just reach out to your partner or manager at the firm here, who will be able to step you through that tomorrow. In terms of that, we really thank everyone for their broad participation. Thank you, Jakin, and thank you, Scott, for answering everyone's questions. There will be a feed of this uploaded onto our website tomorrow. We've got one more question on payroll from John.
So in answer to that, John, it's based on your most recently lodged BAS. So if your most recently lodged business activity statement is for the March quarter, that's the quarter they'll take into account. If you're a monthly lodger of the business activity statement, then they'll take your most recently lodged activity statement for a month. Now, the interesting thing is going to be for large withholders, because obviously large withholders, you don't have a withholding amount, but you've still got to report that on your quarterly or monthly BAS. You've still got to report your gross. So they're looking at W1 on your most recently lodged BAS prior to the 26th of June. So if that was your month of May BAS, not IAS BAS, then they'll look at that. For the vast majority of people who are on a quarterly BAS, they'll look at the March quarter BAS. But sorry, and key point again, this is the BAS lodged before the 26th of June. So if you're late in your BASs, you haven't lodged your BASs for some reason, then they want the most recently lodged BAS prior to 26 June.
Yep, fantastic. I think that that might. Oh, I've got another one here. Yes, Jeremy. I think perhaps they may do, and just as a little bit of comedy, I had grown a COVID beard, as a lot of people have done, and was shaving it off a week or so back, and neglected to do the top lip, and of course all of my staff are slaying me about it, and all of my clients are giving me a hard time too. But for the moment, the moustache stays.
And he'll regrow it when Service New South Wales comes along to audit as a scare tactic for the
men with moustaches are more believable, apparently.
Correct.
Daniel Tan's got a question about new employees.
Mm-hmm. New employees are interesting. Obviously, they'll count for the head count that you're going to declare to Services New South Wales. But again, they're going to be basing the payment off of the March quarter BAS, the W1 figure from the March quarter BAS, or from the most recently lodged BAS that you take. So if you've had new employees since then, so a net increase in your headcount and therefore an increase in your payroll, that's not necessarily going to be taken into account.
Yep.
John, correct.
Yep.
But obviously, again, if you so you need to tell Services in New South Wales about your headcount. So if your headcount has reduced since the March quarter, we don't have a detail about how Services New South Wales is going to reduce the JobSaver payment as they come down. We assume it's just going to be a very, very simple formula, as the weekly payroll number is. But if your headcount has reduced since the March quarter, on the application, you need to tell them that it's reduced.
Yeah, I think critical to note as well in this space here is that the Australian tax, both state and federal, works under the concept of self-assessment. So you are self-assessing. What will be critical is keeping records of what you have self-assessed and the rationale for why you have done so, because the rationale and the records, if you are wrong, will go very much towards mitigation of any fine or penalty.
Yeah. And probably the worst thing about doing this through Service New South Wales doing this is that because it's not the ATO, we're not keeping the records for you.
Yeah. and as well as that, as said, by default, the ATO were really sophisticated in administering this last year. I don't generally say this publicly, but they did a really good job, right? And Service New South Wales are not up to the task. Yep. Okay, well, thank you everyone again for your time. We might go and return and watch a little bit of an Olympics update, I reckon. Again, we're here to help. The recording of this will be uploaded onto our website tomorrow. Anyway, thank you everyone for your time.
Fantastic. Thanks, Heath and Jakin.
Take care.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.